Sir, you need to understand something very clearly. When I call in this debt tomorrow morning, your airline won't just be grounded, it will be erased from existence. The hum of JFK International Airport's Terminal 4 created a symphony of controlled chaos that most travelers found overwhelming. But Darius Mitchell had learned to find peace in the constant motion around him. He sat in the corner of Meridian Airways' premium lounge, swirling a glass of sparkling water while observing the evening rush of business travelers who moved through the space like they owned it. While the men around him wore perfectly tailored Italian suits and checked their platinum watches every 30 seconds, Darius looked like he'd stepped out of a college dormitory rather than a boardroom. His charcoal gray cashmere hoodie was soft and expensive, but to the untrained eye it appeared ordinary paired with well-worn dark jeans and comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. He wasn't trying to blend in with the crowd, and he certainly wasn't trying to impress anyone. This was his way of honoring the woman who had raised him with calloused hands and an unbreakable spirit. 3 months ago, when his grandmother Sarah had passed away at 87, she'd made him promise something that seemed simple but felt revolutionary for a man in his position. Don't let all that money make you forget where you came from, baby, she'd whispered from her hospital bed, her weathered fingers gripping his hand with surprising strength. Stay humble, stay real, and remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. What the other lounge patrons couldn't possibly know was that Darius Mitchell was one of the most feared names on Wall Street, known in financial circles as the Liquidator for his ability to either save dying companies or strip them for parts with surgical precision. At 35, he was the managing partner of Apex Capital Holdings, a private equity firm that specialized in distressed airline acquisitions, and tonight he was carrying documents in his seemingly ordinary laptop bag that were worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. The merger papers for Meridian Airways represented a $2.3 billion lifeline that would either save the airline from bankruptcy or, if unsigned, trigger the most spectacular corporate collapse in aviation history. As he reviewed financial projections on his tablet, a small voice interrupted his concentration, and he looked up to see a little girl with bright, dark eyes and carefully braided hair standing beside his chair. "Excuse me, Mr. 8-year-old Maya Chen said politely, holding a coloring book that had scattered across the floor when she'd tripped over her rolling suitcase. "I'm sorry I dropped my book near your chair." Darius immediately set down his tablet and knelt to help her collect the scattered crayons and pages, noticing that she was traveling with the confident independence of a child who had made this journey before. "No problem at all," he said with a genuine smile, handing her the last wayward crayon. "Are you flying by yourself tonight?" Maya nodded with the serious expression that children wear when they're trying to prove they're grown up enough for important responsibilities. "I'm going to London to visit my mom. She's a doctor there, and she's too busy to come get me, so I have to be brave and fly alone." Something about her matter-of-fact courage reminded him of his grandmother's strength, and he found himself genuinely interested in her story. "Well, you seem pretty brave to me," he told her, and her face lit up with pride at the compliment. When the boarding announcement crackled through the lounge speakers calling for first-class passengers, Darius gathered his belongings and noticed Maya walking toward the gate with her small rolling suitcase, her unaccompanied minor badge hanging around her neck like a medal of honor. He had no idea that this brief encounter with a child's innocent perspective would become crucial to everything that was about to unfold, or that her clear-eyed view of right and wrong would serve as a moral compass when the adults around them lost their way entirely. The gate area buzzed with the familiar energy of an international departure, and Darius approached the boarding podium, where a blonde gate agent named Brittany Walsh was processing the line of first-class passengers with practiced efficiency. She smiled warmly at the businessman ahead of him, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit who reeked of scotch and self-importance, scanning his boarding pass without question and wishing him a pleasant flight with genuine enthusiasm. When Darius stepped forward, and held out his phone displaying the QR code for his boarding pass. Brittany's demeanor shifted so quickly and obviously that several passengers in line behind him noticed the change. Her eyes traveled from the hood of his sweatshirt down to his worn sneakers, and the professional smile vanished from her face like someone had flipped a switch. "Zone 1 boarding is for first-class passengers only." "Sir?" she said, her voice dropping to a tone that suggested she was dealing with someone who didn't understand basic airport procedures. "Economy and Comfort Plus passengers can board in about 20 minutes. You'll need to step aside and wait for your zone to be called." Darius didn't react to her assumption, having dealt with this exact scenario more times than he could count, and simply responded in the calm, measured tone he used when he was about to make someone's day very difficult. "I understand the boarding process," he said quietly, holding his phone steady so she could scan the code. "I'm in seat 1A. Brittany let out a sharp, disbelieving breath through her nose, the kind of sound people make when they think someone is trying to pull a fast one on them, and reluctantly grabbed her scanner while muttering something about people holding up the line with fake tickets. The scanner beeped once, clearly and definitively displaying information that made her pause and blink several times as if the machine was malfunctioning. The screen showed exactly what Darius had told her. Seat 1. A Mitchell Darius full-fare first class with a ticket price that exceeded what many people made in a month. For a moment, Brittany stared at the information as if she could will it to change through sheer force of disbelief, then looked back at Darius with the expression of someone whose worldview had just been challenged by inconvenient facts. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her mistake, just a grudging acceptance that she'd been wrong, and a barely concealed annoyance that he'd been right. "Boarding pass confirms," she muttered, practically shoving his phone back toward him without making eye contact down the jet bridge turn left to first class. As Darius walked past her toward the aircraft, he could feel the curious stares of other passengers who had witnessed the exchange, and he noticed Maya Chen in line behind him, her dark eyes taking in everything with the perceptive intelligence that children often possess when adults think they're not paying attention. The Boeing 777-300ER was a magnificent machine, its first-class cabin bathed in soft ambient lighting that created an atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity. Darius located seat 1. A spacious suite with a sliding privacy door and enough room to work comfortably during the 7-hour flight to London, and he settled in with a sense of relief that the difficult part of his journey was behind him. He had no way of knowing that the real challenges were just beginning, or that his choice to dress casually would trigger a series of events that would destroy one of aviation's most established companies and reshape an entire industry's approach to customer service. Chief Purser Linda Hartwell had been flying for Meridian Airways for 15 years, and she prided herself on being able to read passengers at a glance, categorizing them instantly by their appearance, behavior, and perceived social status. When she noticed the young black man in the hoodie and jeans occupying their most expensive seat, her first instinct was that a mistake had been made, and she approached seat 1A with the confident authority of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. At the same time, commotion erupted near the aircraft door as Blake Whitman, the 28-year-old son of Meridian Airways CEO, Harrison Whitman, made his entrance with all the subtlety of a natural disaster. Blake's platinum blonde hair was styled with expensive products. His designer suit probably cost more than most people's cars, and his entitled attitude filled the cabin like toxic gas that made everyone around him uncomfortable. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he announced loudly enough for the entire first-class section to hear his voice carrying the particular whine of someone who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. "I specifically requested seat 1A when my assistant booked this flight. I don't understand why there's been some kind of mix-up." Linda immediately abandoned her investigation of Darius and hurried to Blake's side, her demeanor shifting to the obsequious deference she reserved for airline royalty and very important passengers. Maya Chen, seated in 2A with her coloring book and the serious expression of a child trying to be brave about flying alone, watched the scene unfold with the clear-eyed perception that adults often lose when their prejudices and assumptions cloud their judgment. Even at 8 years old, she could sense the unfairness in the air, the way the flight attendants treated the two men differently based on nothing more than their appearance and the volume of their voices, and she quietly continued coloring while keeping her ears open to every word being spoken around her. Linda Hartwell approached seat 1A with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the professional expression. Flight attendants, perfect when they're about to deliver news that passengers won't want to hear, but are expected to accept without question. "Sir," she began, her tone carrying just enough sweetness to mask the underlying authority. "I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to have been a booking error in our reservation database, and I'm going to need to ask you to gather your belongings and move to a different seat so we can resolve this situation quickly and get everyone settled for departure." Darius looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing the financial projections that would determine Meridian Airways' fate in less than 12 hours, and something in Linda's tone immediately told him this wasn't about any database error. "I'm not sure what kind of error you're referring to," he replied calmly, pulling up his boarding pass on his phone screen. "My reservation shows seat 1. I paid the full fare price, and your gate agent confirmed the seating assignment when I boarded. So I'm curious what exactly needs to be resolved." From the galley area, Blake Whitman's voice rose to a pitch that bordered on hysteria as he explained to anyone within hearing distance that his father would have people fired if he didn't get the window seat he deserved, and his tantrum was creating the kind of scene that made other passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats while pretending not to notice. Linda glanced back toward Blake, then returned her attention to Darius with the determined expression of someone who had already decided how this situation was going to end regardless of facts, contracts, or basic fairness. "We have a very important passenger who needs this particular seat for security and privacy reasons." She continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone that service workers sometimes use when they think they're dealing with someone who won't understand complex explanations. "I can offer you a lovely seat in our economy comfort section with extra legroom, and of course we'll provide a full refund of the fare difference along with travel vouchers for future flights as compensation for any inconvenience this might cause." Darius set down his laptop and looked directly at Linda with the kind of steady gaze that made investment bankers nervous and corporate executives reconsider their life choices. "Let me make sure I understand what you're suggesting." He said, his voice remaining perfectly calm, even as his words carried an undertone that should have warned her she was walking into dangerous territory. "You want me to give up the seat I paid $11,000 for, move to the back of the plane, and accept vouchers as compensation so that someone else can have my seat, because you've decided he's more important than I am." The conversation had attracted the attention of other first-class passengers, including Maya, who had stopped coloring entirely and was watching the adults with the kind of focused attention children give to situations they instinctively know are wrong, even when they can't fully articulate why. An elderly businessman in seat 2C had paused in his reading to observe the exchange. A well-dressed woman across the aisle was pretending to check her phone while clearly listening to every word, and the tension in the cabin was becoming thick enough to cut with a knife. "It's not about importance," Linda protested, though her defensive tone suggested she knew exactly what it was about. "It's simply an operational necessity that sometimes requires us to make adjustments to accommodate passenger needs." Before Darius could respond, Captain Derek Thompson emerged from the cockpit, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, and his expression carrying the absolute authority of someone who believed his word was law at 35,000 feet above sea level. "Is there a problem here?" Thompson asked, though his question was directed entirely at Linda, and he barely glanced at Darius as if the passenger's perspective on the situation was irrelevant to whatever decision needed to be made. Linda quickly explained the situation in terms that made it sound like Darius was being unreasonable about a simple request, and Thompson nodded with the confidence of someone who had dealt with difficult passengers many times before and knew exactly how to handle them. Sir Thompson said, finally acknowledging Darius directly, but with the condescending tone of an adult addressing a child who was misbehaving. "I'm the captain of this aircraft, which means my word is final when it comes to passenger seating arrangements and operational requirements. I'm giving you a direct order to collect your belongings and move to the seat the crew has assigned to you, because we need to push back from the gate in exactly 5 minutes, and I won't allow one passenger's stubbornness to delay this flight for everyone else." Darius closed his laptop deliberately, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet cabin, and stood to his full height so he could look Thompson directly in the eye when he delivered his response. "Captain Thompson," he said, reading the name tag with careful precision. "My name is Darius Mitchell. I am a paying passenger who has committed no crime, violated no regulations, and broken no laws, and I have a legally binding contract with this airline for this specific seat. If you remove me from this aircraft, you'll be in breach of that contract, and I can promise you that the consequences will be more severe than anything you've ever experienced in your entire career." The warning should have been enough to make any reasonable person pause and reconsider their course of action, but Thompson's ego and assumptions had already committed him to a path he couldn't back down from without losing face in front of his crew and passengers. "Listen to me very carefully," he replied, his voice rising to the volume he typically reserved for emergency situations. "I don't care who you think you are, or what you think you know about contracts. This is my airplane, and what I say goes. You can walk to the back of the plane like a civilized adult, or I can have security drag you off in handcuffs, but either way, you're not staying in that seat." From her seat in 2, a 8-year-old Maya Chen looked up from her coloring book with the kind of innocent confusion that cuts straight through adult rationalization and speaks directly to the heart of moral issues. "Why is everyone being so mean to the nice man who helped me?" she asked in a clear, carrying voice that seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, and for just a moment, the entire first-class cabin fell silent as her simple question forced everyone to confront exactly what they were witnessing. Thompson grabbed the aircraft phone and dialed the number for Port Authority Police, his voice tight with anger and wounded authority, as he made the call that would trigger a sequence of events no one in that cabin could possibly have imagined. "This is Captain Thompson, on Meridian Flight 847, he said into the handset, his eyes never leaving Darius's face. "I need officers at Gate B12 immediately. We have a non-compliant passenger who is refusing direct orders from the flight crew and needs to be removed from the aircraft before we can depart safely." The Port Authority police officers who boarded the aircraft 10 minutes later were exactly the type of men who approached every situation with the assumption that someone needed to be controlled, and when they saw a black man in casual clothes facing off against a uniformed captain and crew, their minds were already made up about who was the problem before they heard a single word of explanation. Officer Martinez was a 15-year veteran who had dealt with countless airport disturbances, while Officer Collins was younger but equally convinced that his badge gave him the authority to handle any situation with whatever level of force he deemed necessary, and neither of them showed any interest in hearing Darius's side of the story. "Where's the problem, Passenger Martinez?" asked Thompson, and the captain pointed directly at Darius as if he were identifying a dangerous criminal rather than a man who was quietly sitting in the seat he had paid for. "Right there. He's been refusing direct orders to move to his assigned seat and has been disrupting the cabin environment since we began boarding procedures." The description bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred, but the officers nodded with the understanding of men who dealt with difficult passengers on a regular basis and knew how to handle them efficiently. Collins approached Seat 1A with the swagger of someone who believed intimidation was an effective tool for solving problems, and he looked down at Darius with the expression police officers practice for dealing with people they've already decided are guilty. "Sir, the captain wants you off the plane," he said in the flat, authoritative tone that was designed to end conversations rather than start them. You can walk off under your own power, or we can carry you off, but either way, you're leaving this aircraft right now." What neither officer noticed was that Jennifer Torres, the actress seated in 3A, who had 53 million followers across her social media platforms, had already begun recording the interaction with her phone, holding the device low and angled carefully to capture everything, while appearing to simply scroll through messages. She had recognized something in the situation that triggered every instinct she had developed over years of witnessing and documenting injustice, and she knew that whatever was about to happen needed to be preserved as evidence for the world to see. "Officers, I need you to understand something very important," Darius said, his voice remaining calm and measured, even as he could see the situation spiraling toward violence. "I have committed no crime. I am not intoxicated, I am not being disruptive, and I have not violated any airline regulations or federal aviation rules. I am a passenger with a valid ticket for this exact seat, and if you remove me from this aircraft by force, you will be committing assault against an innocent person while the entire incident is being recorded by multiple witnesses." The mention of recording seemed to irritate Martinez rather than concern him, and he stepped closer to Darius with the aggressive body language that was designed to intimidate people into compliance. "Stop trying to lawyer your way out of this." He snapped his patience, clearly exhausted by what he saw as typical passenger nonsense. "The captain has absolute authority over this aircraft, and when he says you're trespassing, that means you're trespassing. Now get up and walk off this plane before this gets ugly for everyone involved." Maya Chen watched the confrontation with wide eyes, her coloring book forgotten in her lap as she observed adults behaving in ways that her young mind recognized as fundamentally wrong, even though she couldn't fully understand the complex dynamics of prejudice and power that were driving their actions. "Stop it!" she called out in her clear child's voice when Martinez grabbed Darius's arm. "He didn't do anything bad. Why are you being mean to him?" Her innocent protest fell on deaf ears as Collins moved to Darius's other side, and together the two officers began the process of forcibly removing a passenger who had done nothing more than refuse to give up the seat he had legally purchased. They grabbed his arms and yanked him upward with unnecessary violence, and when Darius instinctively tried to maintain his balance, they shouted, "Stop resisting," loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, creating the false narrative that would later be used to justify their actions. Darius's glasses flew off his face as the officers twisted his arms behind his back, and the expensive frames skittered across the cabin floor until they came to rest near Captain Thompson's polished shoes. With deliberate cruelty that seemed to energize him, Thompson lifted his foot and brought it down hard on the glasses, grinding the lenses and frames into fragments with a sound that made several passengers gasp in shock and disgust. The physical assault that followed was captured in vivid detail by Jennifer Torres's phone as the officers dragged Darius down the narrow aisle, his expensive hoodie riding up to expose his back, his feet barely touching the ground as they manhandled him past horrified passengers who sat frozen in their seats, unwilling or unable to intervene in the brutality unfolding before their eyes. Blake Whitman now comfortably settled in the stolen seat. A leaned forward as Darius was dragged past him and whispered with vicious satisfaction, "Now you know your place." The words were captured clearly on video, along with the expression of cold hatred on Blake's face, and the sight of Darius being hauled through the cabin like a piece of luggage rather than a human being with rights and dignity. Maya's voice could be heard on the recording crying out, "Stop hurting him. Stop hurting my friend," as tears streamed down her face, her child's emotional response serving as a moral compass that pointed directly at the injustice everyone was witnessing. By the time the officers reached the aircraft door, Darius's wrists were already showing the marks where the handcuffs had cut into his skin. His shoulder was sending shooting pains down his arm from being twisted at an unnatural angle, and his dignity had been stripped away in front of dozens of witnesses who would never forget what they had seen. As they shoved him onto the jet bridge and toward a waiting police car, he could hear the captain's voice over the intercom, smooth and professional, apologizing to the passengers for the delay and assuring them that their safety and comfort were the airline's highest priorities. Jennifer Torres had built her massive social media following by being authentic, fearless, and unafraid to speak truth to power, which was exactly what she did at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean when she connected to the aircraft's satellite internet and began uploading the most damaging video in airline industry history. Her fingers moved quickly across her phone screen as she crafted a caption that would capture the attention of her 53 million followers and trigger the kind of viral response that could destroy reputations and topple corporations overnight. I just watched at Meridian Air Security assault an innocent passenger, so the CEO's spoiled son could steal his first-class seat. She typed, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of what she had witnessed and the anger that was building in her chest. This is the most disgusting abuse of power I've ever seen in my life. The passenger was calm, respectful, and had done absolutely nothing wrong except exist while black in a space where entitled white people didn't think he belonged. Hashtag justice. For Darius. Hashtag Meridian. Meltdown. Hashtag boycott. Meridian. The video began uploading immediately its 47 seconds of footage, showing everything from the initial confrontation to Darius being dragged down the aisle while Blake Whitman celebrated in the background and Maya Chen cried for the adults to stop hurting her friend. Within the first 10 minutes of being posted, the video had generated over 100,000 views, and the algorithm began pushing it to users who had shown interest in social justice content, airline travel, and viral news stories. What happened next was the kind of digital detective work that the internet does better than any law enforcement agency, as thousands of users began analyzing every frame of the video to identify the people involved and uncover the truth behind what they were seeing. A user named Tech Sleuth paused the video at the 12-second mark and zoomed in on Darius's wrist, where a glimpse of an extremely expensive watch was visible beneath his casual clothing. Not just any timepiece, but a Patek Philippe Grand Complications worth more than most people's houses. Hold up, everybody, Tech Sleuth posted in a comment that would be shared thousands of times. That's not some random passenger they assaulted. Look at that watch and tell me this guy doesn't have serious money. Someone needs to figure out who this man actually is, because I have a feeling Meridian Airlines just made the biggest mistake in corporate history. The comment triggered a flood of responses as amateur investigators began running facial recognition searches, analyzing the high-quality video for additional clues, and cross-referencing their findings with financial databases and business publications. Within 30 minutes, a user called Wall Street Hawk had identified Darius Mitchell with 99.8% certainty, posting side-by-side photos that showed the man being dragged off the plane next to a professional headshot from a recent Forbes article about the most powerful investors in distressed asset acquisition. Holy shit, the post began in capital letters that conveyed the magnitude of the discovery. They didn't just assault some random passenger. They assaulted Darius Mitchell, the billionaire known as the Liquidator, who literally owns the debt on half the Fortune 500. The revelation exploded across social media platforms like a nuclear bomb as users began sharing the post with commentary that ranged from disbelief to schadenfreude to righteous anger about the treatment Darius had received. Financial news outlets picked up the story within the hour. Business journalists began making phone calls to verify the information, and stock market analysts started calculating what kind of damage this incident might do to Meridian Airways' already precarious financial position. Maya Chen's innocent testimony, recorded by Jennifer Torres as the child tried to protect the nice man who helped me, became a powerful symbol of moral clarity in a situation where adults had completely lost their way. Her tearful voice asking, "Why are the mean people hurting my friend" was shared millions of times across platforms, with users commenting that it took an 8-year-old to see the situation clearly, while every adult in positions of authority had failed to do the right thing. The hashtags #JusticeForDarius and #MeridianMeltdown began trending globally within 2 hours of the video being posted, with celebrities, politicians, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens sharing their outrage about what they had witnessed. The actor Samuel L. Jackson posted a response that simply said, "This is why we can't have nice things. Entitled white people literally can't handle seeing black excellence in spaces they think belong to them." The tweet was shared over 2 million times in the first hour alone, as the plane continued its journey toward London, completely cut off from the digital firestorm raging below. Blake Whitman was enjoying his stolen seat, blissfully unaware that his moment of petty cruelty had been witnessed by tens of millions of people who were already calling for his head. Captain Thompson had disabled the aircraft's Wi-Fi system, claiming technical difficulties because he could sense that something had gone wrong with his handling of the situation, but he had no idea that his career, his reputation, and his entire industry were being dismantled in real time by an angry global audience that had seen enough injustice for one lifetime. The holding cell at JFK's Port Authority precinct smelled like industrial disinfectant and decades of human desperation. But Darius Mitchell sat on the metal bench with the composed stillness of someone who had learned to find inner peace in the most chaotic circumstances. While most people in his position would have been pacing, shouting for lawyers or threatening lawsuits, Darius closed his eyes and began the meditation practice his grandmother had taught him when he was Maya's age, focusing on his breathing while the storm of his thoughts settled into the kind of crystalline clarity that had made him one of the most feared names on Wall Street. What the officers who had processed his arrest didn't realize was that outside the concrete walls of their precinct, his assault had triggered a digital avalanche that was already reshaping public opinion, financial markets, and corporate boardrooms around the world. The video of his removal had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms, generating the kind of viral engagement that advertising executives spend years trying to achieve, and every view was another nail in Meridian Airways' corporate coffin. The first sign that something had changed came when Precinct Captain Rodriguez burst through the holding area doors with the expression of someone who had just discovered that he was standing in the middle of a minefield, followed closely by 2 officers who looked like they had recently learned they were about to become the most famous police officers in America, for all the wrong reasons. Mr. Mitchell Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the kind of respectful caution that people use when they're talking to someone who could destroy their career with a phone call. "There's been a development in your situation that requires immediate attention." Martinez and Collins, the officers who had dragged Darius off the plane, stood behind their captain, looking like they wished they could disappear into the floor, and their body language told him everything he needed to know about how dramatically the balance of power had shifted in the past few hours. "I've just received calls from the mayor's office, the governor's office, and 3 federal agencies." Rodriguez continued, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning, "and it's been strongly suggested that we resolve this matter immediately and with full cooperation from everyone involved." Darius opened his eyes and looked at the 3 officers with the expression of someone who had been expecting this exact conversation, though perhaps not quite this quickly. "Am I being charged with any crimes, Captain?" he asked, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used when negotiating billion-dollar deals with corporate executives who thought they could intimidate him into accepting unfavorable terms. "No, sir," Rodriguez replied immediately, producing Darius's iPhone from a plastic evidence bag with hands that shook slightly as he held it out. "All charges have been dropped, and we're prepared to provide transportation to any location you specify, along with medical attention, if needed for any injuries you might have sustained during the arrest process." The offer of medical attention was clearly an attempt to head off potential lawsuits, but Darius was more interested in the phone that contained his connection to the financial empire he had built over 15 years of ruthless deal-making. When he powered on the device, It vibrated continuously for nearly a full minute, as hundreds of missed calls, thousands of text messages, and countless social media notifications flooded the screen in a digital tsunami that confirmed what he had already suspected. His assault had become a global news event, and the consequences were already rippling through markets, newsrooms, and corporate headquarters around the world. He scrolled through the notifications just long enough to confirm the scale of what was happening, then opened his contacts and dialed the number for Sarah Kim, his chief operating officer and the person he trusted most to execute the kind of corporate warfare that was about to commence. Darius. "Thank God you're okay," Sarah answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry and barely controlled rage. "I've been watching the footage non-stop, and our legal team is already preparing assault charges, civil rights violation suits, and about 15 other ways to destroy everyone involved in what happened to you. The video has been viewed by over 80 million people, and the public response is absolutely nuclear. Meridian stock is already down 40% in after-hours trading." Darius listened to her report while walking out of the precinct into the New York night, his shoulder still aching from the officer's rough handling, but his mind already focused on the systematic destruction of everyone who had humiliated him. "Sarah, I need you to listen very carefully," he said, his voice dropping to the tone he used when he was about to end someone's career, "because we're going to do something that will be remembered long after everyone involved is dead and buried." The instructions he gave her over the next 10 minutes were delivered with the precision of a military commander planning an invasion, each element designed to create maximum damage while remaining completely legal and utterly devastating. "Execute Protocol Omega immediately," he said, using the code name for the most aggressive corporate attack strategy his firm had ever developed. "I want short positions worth $3 billion against Meridian stock. I want all their outstanding debt called in simultaneously, and I want the merger documents destroyed before they can even attempt to save themselves." Sarah's intake of breath was audible even over the phone connection. "Darius, if we do that, Meridian Airways will be bankrupt by morning," she said, her voice carrying both excitement and concern about the magnitude of what he was proposing. 35,000 employees will lose their jobs and the entire industry will feel the shockwaves for years to come. Good Darius replied, his grandmother's lessons about dignity and respect echoing in his mind as he thought about Blake Whitman's whispered words and Captain Thompson's deliberate destruction of his glasses. They should have thought about those employees before they decided that assaulting passengers was an acceptable way to do business. They wanted to teach me about knowing my place. Now I'm going to teach them about consequences. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Meridian Airways headquarters in London offered a panoramic view of the Thames. But Harrison Whitman wasn't looking at the scenery as he sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, surrounded by 12 of the most powerful executives in commercial aviation. The 60-year-old CEO had built his reputation on an image of unshakable confidence and corporate authority. But this morning, his silver hair was disheveled. His usually perfect tie was askew, and his hands trembled slightly as he stared at the financial data that spelled out the complete destruction of everything he had spent his career building. The numbers on the massive display screen were updated in real time, and each refresh brought worse news as Meridian's stock price plummeted toward levels that would trigger automatic bankruptcy proceedings. Pre-market trading had opened with the company's shares down 70%. And the selling pressure was so intense that the London Stock Exchange had already halted trading twice to prevent a complete collapse that would drag down other airline stocks in the process. "How bad is it?" Elias Harrison asked his chief financial officer, though the hollow tone of his voice suggested he already knew the answer would be catastrophic. Elias Johnson was a man who had navigated corporate crises for over 20 years, but he had never dealt with anything approaching the scale of the disaster that was currently unfolding in boardrooms, trading floors, and newspaper offices around the world. "It's the worst financial crisis in aviation history," Elias replied, his voice barely above a whisper, as he consulted the tablet that contained information he wished he didn't have to share with his colleagues. The video has been viewed by over 200 million people worldwide, and the public response has been so overwhelmingly negative that we're facing boycotts, investor flight, and regulatory investigations in 17 different countries. But that's not the worst part. Harrison closed his eyes and waited for the additional blow he could sense coming, knowing that whatever Elias was about to tell him would be even worse than the complete annihilation of his company's stock value and reputation. The worst part, Elias continued, his hands shaking as he scrolled through legal documents on his tablet, is that we've just received formal notification that Apex Capital Holdings is calling in all our outstanding debt immediately, and the total amount due is $2.3 billion, which we have to pay within 24 hours or face immediate liquidation. The silence that followed this announcement was the kind of absolute quiet that occurs in the moments before buildings collapse, and every executive in the room understood that they were witnessing the end of a corporate empire that had taken decades to build but only hours to destroy. Victoria Banks. The company's general counsel finally broke the silence with the kind of question that lawyers ask when they're trying to find any possible way to avoid complete disaster. Is there any possibility of negotiating an extension or restructuring the debt service requirements, she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be negative. We could offer additional collateral personal guarantees from board members or equity stakes in exchange for breathing room to address the crisis. Elias shook his head with the finality of someone delivering a death sentence to people he had worked alongside for years. Apex Holdings has rejected all communication attempts, he replied, pulling up emails and legal documents that showed the complete breakdown of any possible negotiation. Their position is that Meridian Airways has demonstrated corporate behavior that violates the terms of our lending agreements, specifically the clause about maintaining industry standards for customer service and public relations. They're treating this as a breach of contract that allows them to demand immediate repayment of the full debt load. Harrison's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and when he looked at the screen, he saw his son's name and realized that Blake was probably still on the aircraft, completely unaware that his tantrum had triggered the destruction of the family business and the financial ruin of everyone connected to it. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. His son was literally flying toward London in the first-class seat that had cost them everything, enjoying champagne and luxury service, while the empire that had provided his privileged lifestyle crumbled into bankruptcy and disgrace. Sir Peter Hamilton, his executive assistant, spoke up from the corner of the room where he had been fielding phone calls from reporters, regulators, and angry investors. The BBC is requesting an immediate interview. The Financial Times wants a comment for their front-page story, and the Civil Aviation Authority has announced they're opening a formal investigation into our passenger service protocols. Also, our insurance company has just informed us that they're reviewing our coverage in light of the incident. The final piece of information hit Harrison like a physical blow because he knew that losing their insurance coverage would make it impossible to operate any flights at all, effectively grounding their entire fleet and eliminating any remaining hope of generating revenue while they dealt with the crisis. As he sat in his executive chair surrounded by the wreckage of his life's work, he couldn't help but think about the passenger his son had displaced and wonder what kind of man could orchestrate such complete and efficient corporate destruction in less than 12 hours. Blake Whitman woke up as the Boeing 777 descended through the gray London clouds, stretching luxuriously in the first-class seat he had stolen through his tantrum, and his father's corporate influence, completely unaware that the ground he was about to land on had shifted beneath his feet in ways that would reshape his entire existence. He had slept soundly during the 8-hour flight, enjoying the extra space and privacy of Seat 1. A while dreaming about the business meetings and social events that awaited him in London, where his father's corporate connections had arranged opportunities that his own limited talents could never have secured. The cabin crew had maintained their professional demeanor throughout the flight, but Linda Hartwell and the other attendants had noticed something troubling in the messages they'd received from colleagues on the ground. References to news coverage, social media storms, and corporate crisis that seemed to be connected to the incident they'd witnessed during boarding. Captain Thompson had kept the aircraft's internet disabled throughout the flight, claiming technical difficulties that prevented passengers from accessing email or social media. But his real motivation was a growing sense that something had gone very wrong with his handling of the situation. As the plane taxied toward the gate at Heathrow, Blake checked his phone, expecting to find the usual collection of social media notifications and messages from friends. But instead, he discovered that his device had no signal and couldn't connect to any networks. A technical problem that frustrated him but didn't cause any real concern, since he assumed it would be resolved once he reached the terminal building. What he didn't know was that his father had instructed the family's telecommunications company to suspend service on Blake's devices in a desperate attempt to control the narrative and prevent him from making the situation worse with ill-considered social media posts. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when the aircraft door opened, and instead of the usual ground crew and customs officials, Blake saw 3 uniformed officers from the Metropolitan Police, accompanied by 2 serious-looking individuals in expensive suits who carried briefcases and the kind of official identification that indicated government authority at the highest levels. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Thompson announced over the intercom, his voice carrying a tension that made passengers look up from their phones and magazines, "we're going to need everyone to remain seated while authorities board the aircraft to handle an official matter. This should only take a few minutes, and we appreciate your patience and cooperation." The announcement created an immediate buzz of speculation among the passengers, but Blake was still convinced that whatever was happening had nothing to do with him. Detective Inspector Sarah Crawford was the first officer to enter the first-class cabin, and she approached seat 1A with the measured steps of someone who had arrested wealthy, powerful people before and knew exactly how to handle their initial shock and denial. "Blake Whitman," she said, holding up her identification while her colleagues positioned themselves strategically around the cabin. "You're under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit assault, interference with flight crew operations, and violations of the Civil Aviation Act related to passenger safety and discrimination." The words hit Blake like a physical blow, and for several seconds he simply stared at the detective while his brain struggled to process information that didn't match his expectations about how this day was supposed to unfold. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice rising to the pitch it always reached when he encountered situations he couldn't control through wealth or family connections. "I'm Blake Whitman. My father is Harrison Whitman, the CEO of Meridian Airways. I haven't done anything wrong." Detective Inspector Crawford had dealt with entitled rich children before, and Blake's response was exactly what she had expected from someone who had never faced consequences for his actions and genuinely believed that his family name provided immunity from accountability. "Sir, we have video evidence of your behavior during the boarding process, along with witness testimony and additional evidence that will be presented during your court hearing," she replied, signaling to her colleagues to begin the arrest process. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to use that right until you've spoken with a qualified attorney." As the handcuffs clicked around Blake's wrists, the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his consciousness, and he looked around the first-class cabin, desperately seeking some explanation for what was happening to him. Jennifer Torres, the actress who had recorded the entire incident, was watching from seat 3A with the satisfied expression of someone who had helped bring justice to a situation that demanded accountability. And when Blake's eyes met hers, she held up her phone to show him the video that had destroyed his life. 47 seconds, she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume for him to hear clearly. "That's how long it took for you to show the world exactly who you really are. And now over 300 million people have seen what you're capable of when you think nobody important is watching." The officers led Blake off the aircraft while other passengers recorded his arrest on their phones, creating additional footage that would be shared across social media platforms within minutes of the plane reaching the gate. Captain Thompson was arrested immediately after Blake his removal from the cockpit, witnessed by his own crew members who had worked under his command for years, but had never seen him face consequences for the authoritarian behavior they had all observed in different situations. Linda Hartwell and 2 other flight attendants were detained for questioning their careers, effectively ending the moment they were let off the aircraft by investigators who had already compiled extensive evidence about the pattern of discriminatory behavior that had led to Darius Mitchell's assault. As Blake was processed through the airport's detention facility, he kept insisting that the entire situation was a misunderstanding that would be resolved as soon as his father's lawyers arrived. But the officers handling his case had already been briefed about Meridian Airways' financial collapse and the legal jeopardy facing every member of the Whitman family. By the time he was allowed to make his first phone call, Blake was about to discover that his father was facing his own criminal charges, and that the corporate empire that had protected him his entire life had ceased to exist while he was sleeping in a stolen first-class seat. Darius Mitchell stood in his corner office overlooking Central Park, his left arm still in a sling from the shoulder injury he'd sustained when Port Authority officers twisted his limbs during his arrest watching the morning news coverage of what financial journalists were already calling the most spectacular corporate collapse in aviation history. The scar on his wrist from the handcuffs had faded to a thin pink line, but he rubbed it occasionally as a reminder of the humiliation he'd endured and the systematic destruction he'd unleashed in response. Sarah Kim entered the office carrying a tablet loaded with the final financial reports that quantified exactly how much damage their coordinated assault on Meridian Airways had achieved in the 4 days since Darius's removal from Flight 847. "The numbers are even better than we projected," she said, setting the device on his desk with the satisfied expression of someone who had just executed the most successful hostile takeover in corporate history. "Our short positions generated $4.2 billion in profit, and Meridian's complete liquidation means we've acquired their most valuable assets for approximately 15 cents on the dollar." The mathematics of revenge had worked out perfectly. But as Darius reviewed the spreadsheets and profit statements, he found himself thinking about his grandmother's lessons regarding the difference between justice and cruelty, and wondering whether the total annihilation of his enemies had honored her memory or betrayed the values she had tried to instill in him during his childhood. 35,000 Meridian employees had lost their jobs when the company filed for bankruptcy. Pension funds had been wiped out, and families across multiple continents were facing financial hardship because of decisions made by executives they had never met. "What's the status on the Employee Assistance Fund?" he asked, referring to the $500 million program he'd established to provide financial support job placement services and retraining opportunities for workers who had been displaced by Meridian's collapse. Sarah pulled up additional documents showing the fund's activities, including partnerships with other airlines, educational institutions, and government agencies that were working to minimize the human cost of the corporate warfare he'd initiated. "We've placed 63% of former Meridian employees in equivalent or better positions with other carriers," she reported, "and another 22% are enrolled in retraining programs that will qualify them for jobs in expanding sectors of the aviation industry. The pension replacement program has restored retirement security for everyone who lost benefits, and we're tracking individual cases to ensure no one falls through the cracks." Congressional hearings had been announced within days of the viral video, with lawmakers from both parties expressing outrage about passenger rights violations and calling for comprehensive reform of airline industry practices that allowed discrimination to flourish in what was supposed to be a regulated public utility. The Federal Aviation Administration had launched its own investigation. The Department of Transportation was reviewing civil rights compliance across the entire industry, and international aviation authorities were implementing new protocols to prevent similar incidents from occurring in their jurisdictions. Blake Whitman had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges, and his father, Harrison, was facing a longer sentence on charges related to corporate malfeasance, securities fraud, and creating the corporate culture that had enabled discriminatory practices to become standard operating procedure. Captain Derek Thompson had been banned from commercial aviation for life, his pilot's license permanently revoked, and he was facing civil lawsuits from multiple passengers who had witnessed or experienced similar treatment on flights under his command. The broader impact of the incident had spread far beyond the destruction of one airline, as other carriers scrambled to review their own policies, retrain their staff, and demonstrate their commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. Industry-wide changes included mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, standardized protocols for handling passenger disputes, and enhanced oversight of situations involving VIP customers or employee relatives who might receive preferential treatment. Darius had received thousands of letters, emails, and messages from people who had experienced similar discrimination in various contexts, thanking him for using his resources and influence to fight back against treatment that most people had no power to challenge. Maya Chen had sent him a handwritten note with a drawing of an airplane, thanking him for being nice to her and asking if he would visit her school to talk about standing up for what's right, an invitation that had moved him more than any business achievement in his career. The Phoenix Airways announcement had been scheduled for the following week, and Darius planned to reveal his vision for an airline built on principles of dignity, respect, and service that would honor his grandmother's memory while proving that profitability and ethical behavior were not mutually exclusive goals in the modern business environment. 6 months after the incident that had reshaped an entire industry, Darius Mitchell walked through the departure gate at JFK Terminal 4 wearing a Phoenix Airways uniform and carrying a silver coffee pot, personally serving beverages to passengers who still couldn't quite believe that a billionaire CEO was taking their drink orders with genuine enthusiasm and attention to detail. The inaugural flight of his new airline was scheduled to depart for London in 30 minutes, following the exact same route where his humiliation had been transformed into a movement for justice and human dignity. Maya Chen, now 9 years old, and traveling with her mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, to visit her grandmother in London, had been personally invited by Darius to christen the new airline's first flight, and she sat in seat 1A with the serious expression of a child who understood that she was participating in something important and historic. Her presence in the premium seat served as a symbol of the values Phoenix Airways represented, that every passenger deserved respect, courtesy, and consideration, regardless of their age, appearance, or economic status. Mr. Darius, Maya said as he approached her seat with the coffee service, using the name she had called him since their first meeting in the Meridian Lounge. "I'm really proud of you for making a nice airplane company where nobody gets hurt for sitting in the wrong place." Her simple observation captured the essence of what he had tried to build with Phoenix Airways, and her approval meant more to him than any business award or financial milestone he had achieved in his career. The transformation of the aviation industry had accelerated beyond anything regulatory agencies or consumer advocates had thought possible, with Phoenix Airways serving as a model that other carriers were rushing to emulate in order to avoid the fate that had befallen Meridian. Employee training programs focused on unconscious bias. Customer service protocols emphasized dignity and respect, and management structures had been redesigned to prevent the kind of authoritarian abuse that had characterized the old industry culture. Blake Whitman had served 8 months of his sentence and was scheduled for release in 10 months, but his prison interviews with criminal justice reform advocates suggested that his time behind bars had forced him to confront the privilege and entitlement that had shaped his worldview since childhood. His most recent statement, published in a magazine article about rehabilitation and redemption, included a direct apology to Darius and a commitment to dedicating his post-release life to working with organizations that promoted equality and understanding across racial lines. Harrison Whitman was serving a longer sentence, but had used his time to establish educational programs for inmates, drawing on his business experience to help other prisoners develop job skills and prepare for re-entry into society. His letters to Darius, delivered through attorneys and victims' rights organizations, expressed genuine remorse for the corporate culture he had created and the personal responsibility he accepted for his son's behavior and the treatment Darius had received. Captain Derek Thompson had initially responded to his career destruction with anger and denial, but a chance encounter with a former Meridian passenger who shared her own story of discriminatory treatment had opened his eyes to the pattern of behavior he had enabled throughout his career. He was now working with pilot training organizations to develop educational materials that helped aviation professionals recognize and prevent bias in their interactions with passengers and crew members. Linda Hartwell had left the aviation industry entirely and was working as a customer service trainer for hospitality companies, using her experience to teach other service workers about the importance of treating every customer with equal respect and consideration. Her presentations included detailed analysis of the Meridian incident, and she had become an advocate for industry reforms that would prevent other employees from making the same mistakes she had made. Dr. Lisa Chen squeezed her daughter's hand as the Phoenix Airways flight prepared for takeoff, knowing that Maya's brief friendship with Darius Mitchell had given her a front-row seat to one of the most important lessons about justice and courage that she would ever witness. "Do you understand what happened here, sweetheart?" she asked as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Maya nodded with the wisdom of a child who had seen adults behave badly and then watched one of them find a way to make things better. "The mean people learned that being mean has consequences," Maya replied, "and Mr. Darius showed everyone that you should always stand up for what's right even when it's scary or difficult." Her assessment captured the essence of the transformation that had occurred not just in the aviation industry, but in the broader conversation about dignity, respect, and the responsibility that comes with power and privilege. As Phoenix Airways Flight 001 reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic Ocean, Darius Mitchell made his way through the cabin with the practiced ease of someone who had found his true calling in service to others, stopping to chat with passengers, checking on their comfort, and personally ensuring that every person aboard his aircraft felt valued and respected regardless of which section their ticket had assigned them to occupy. The airline's motto, "Dignity is not an upgrade," was displayed prominently throughout the cabin, serving as a constant reminder that respect for human worth was the foundation upon which every aspect of the company's operations had been built. The business model that industry experts had initially questioned was proving remarkably successful, with Phoenix Airways achieving profitability within its first quarter of operations and generating customer loyalty scores that exceeded anything previously recorded in commercial aviation. Passengers were willing to pay premium prices for an airline that treated them like human beings rather than revenue units, and the company's commitment to ethical treatment had attracted top talent from across the industry who wanted to work for an organization that aligned with their personal values. Maya Chen had become something of a corporate mascot for Phoenix Airways, not through any formal arrangement, but because her innocent perspective on the original incident had provided moral clarity that helped shape the company's culture and policies. Darius had established a college scholarship fund in her name, and their correspondence over the past months had evolved into a mentoring relationship that kept him grounded in the human impact of his business decisions rather than getting lost in financial projections and market analysis. The ripple effects of the Meridian Airways collapse had spread far beyond the aviation industry, with business schools now teaching case studies about the incident as an example of how corporate culture, leadership, accountability, and social media could combine to either build or destroy companies in the modern economy. The hashtag dignity not upgrade had become a rallying cry for consumer rights advocates across multiple industries, and companies in sectors ranging from hospitality to retail had implemented training programs designed to prevent the kind of discriminatory treatment that had triggered Meridian's downfall. Darius's personal transformation had been as significant as his professional success, as he had discovered that using his wealth and influence to lift others up provided more satisfaction than any financial transaction he had ever completed during his years as the liquidator. His grandmother's lessons about humility, service, and treating every person with dignity had found expression in an airline that proved profitability and ethical behavior were not only compatible but mutually reinforcing in ways that benefited everyone involved. The final scene of this remarkable story unfolded as Darius personally served coffee to passengers in economy class, chatting with a young mother traveling with her infant son, helping an elderly gentleman with his reading light, and checking on a nervous flyer who was taking her first international flight. When he reached the back of the cabin, he paused to look out the window at the vast expanse of ocean below, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a holding cell to the cockpit of moral leadership in American business. Maya's voice echoed in his memory with the simple wisdom she had shared during their most recent phone conversation. "Mr. Darius, you kept your promise about making flying nice for everyone, and now when people are mean to other people, they have to think about what happened to those bad airplane people." Her childlike summary of the situation captured something profound about accountability consequences and the possibility of positive change when people with resources and influence choose to use their power in service of justice rather than personal advantage. As the Phoenix Airways flight continued toward London, carrying passengers who represented dozens of countries, countless backgrounds, and every economic level, Darius reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in his own life, but in the broader conversation about dignity, respect, and the fundamental humanity that connects all people regardless of their appearance, accent, or assigned seat number. The boy who had learned about fairness and kindness from his grandmother's calloused hands had grown into a man who could reshape entire industries, and he had chosen to use that power to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure the humiliation and injustice that had nearly broken his spirit on a dark night at JFK Airport. The legacy of that terrible evening had become a movement that extended far beyond aviation, inspiring changes in corporate culture, customer service training, and social consciousness that would benefit millions of people who would never know the name Darius Mitchell, but would experience the dignity and respect that his courage had helped establish as the standard rather than the exception in human interactions. True power, he had learned, was not about commanding fear or demanding deference. It was about creating spaces where every person could flourish, where children like Maya could travel safely and confidently, and where the simple act of treating others with kindness could transform not just individual lives, but entire systems that had been built on exclusion and hierarchy. And as Phoenix Airways soared through the night sky, carrying its passengers toward their destinations with safety, comfort, and dignity, Darius Mitchell had finally found his place in the world, not in Seat 1A, but in service to everyone who needed someone to stand up and make things right. This story of justice transformation and the power of standing up for what's right shows us that dignity should never be a luxury reserved for the privileged few. When we treat others with respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances, we create a better world for everyone. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage and justice that remind us how individual actions can spark movements that change everything.